Welcome to the lecture series of the Arcturian Path Sanctuaries International. This lecture will be primarily on the character of the Elohim in the Hebrew Testament of the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and why these Elohim are not, as explained in the book and in other episodes, divine beings, but are in fact extraterrestrial beings who've been active on Earth for millions of years, but with humanity and genetically manipulating the creation of humanity within the past 200,000 years. But how these beings are extraterrestrial in nature and not quote-unquote divine as we normally understand divine. They are not gods, in other words. So the first passage, of course, Genesis 1, it says, the Elohim, in the beginning, the Elohim created or began to create, and then it goes through different aspects of creation up to humanity. And in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, we see the phrase, translated into English, of course, from the Hebrew, that the Elohim made humankind in their own image. Of course, plural. Elohim is plural. And, when read at face value, without any of the theological interpretive overlay of the last 2 to 3 millennia, it's clear that there are multiple beings agreeing to create human beings. There's this council of gods, so-called council of beings, extraterrestrial beings, that are choosing to create humanity in their own image. So the words themselves really accentuate the fact that it's not a singular God, a spirit out there somewhere creating humankind, but it is in fact physical extraterrestrial beings genetically manipulating existing primate species at that time to create humanity. Now, what is the character of these extraterrestrial beings? I think that is a crucial question as we begin to understand who we are as humans, as creations of the Elohim, and our place in that creation. So as one reads through the Hebrew scriptures, one can begin to see the personalities of these Elohim in action with the Hebrew people. And it's often not a pretty sight. First of all, the Elohim is not a singular being, right? It's a multiplicity of beings. So in the Hebrew Testament, especially in the Pentateuch, but throughout the Hebrew Testament, we find Yahweh, who is an Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, Adonai. There are various Elohim, right, who are united in purpose, but they are very distinct beings. There is not one God in the Hebrew Testament. There are multiple beings, multiple Elohim. And it's very clear in the Hebrew, which is the original language of the Old Testament, that there are this multiplicity of beings. So what are they like? Well, we read when the Genesis chapter 6, the so-called sons of God saw the daughters of men and desired them. These sons of God, of course, being members of the Elohim, extraterrestrials, who mated in one way or another with human women. This can be seen as part of the hybridization program, or at least an early attempt at a hybridization program. But we see that they take what they want. That there was, of course, no equality between these so-called sons of God and the daughters of men. And then we read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, how for whatever reason the Elohim were angry at those two cities, at the inhabitants of those two cities, so destroyed them in what can only be seen in contemporary terms as a bombing of some sort, possibly even a nuclear attack. And then we read, on into the book of Exodus, when God, so-called Yahweh, visits Moses on the top of Mount Sinai to give the 10 Commandments. And what is the first of those commandments? Love the Lord your God, right? Do not worship any other gods before the Hebrew God. Now remember, we're not talking about gods here. We're talking about extraterrestrial beings. So we have as the first commandment to the Hebrew people, commandment rooted in jealousy, in pride, right? This extraterrestrial being is say, worship me and no other or else. What kind of God would act that way? These are beings with a range of emotion and reaction, often very violent and certainly manipulative. And as we read on throughout the entire Hebrew Testament, of course you can see episodes where these beings at least seem to be kind in some way. Although we have to keep in mind that the Elohim are fundamentally, in their nature, abusive and manipulative. Right? So any action or behavior that appears to be kind coming from the Elohim would be a manipulative action or behavior, acting a certain way to get something. But what we mostly see are behaviors and reactions of the Elohim towards the Hebrew people and people of other nations that are violent and abusive. We have the Elohim in Chronicles and Joshua, in those biblical books, ordering the Jewish people to commit genocidal action, to eradicate men, women, and children of other tribes and nations around them. We see a very jealous group of beings in the way that they want the Hebrew people to act towards them. All right, so the basic point of the matter is, when we are considering the Elohim as a group of extraterrestrials that genetically created humanity, that claimed the Hebrew tribe as their people, as their own people, and then as this belief system evolved around the Elohim to form the Jewish religion, and then Christianity, of course, grew out of the Jewish religion. We see how really all three of the monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were born of manipulative, abusive, extraterrestrial beings that control humanity like puppet masters. And, over the 2 or 3 millennia, when the scriptures were taken from their oral form into written form, a theology grew up around these Elohim and their behavior. A theologizing that muted the truth of the matter of who these beings were and what they were about. So that nowadays almost all Jewish people, Christian people, Islamic people, even though I would say the Quran is quite different than the Bible in many respects. But even so, people of these 3 monotheistic faiths now view the Elohim as a singular spirit, capital S spirit. God who doesn't change, who is all loving, all merciful. And really all a person needs to do is read the Hebrew scriptures, especially the Old Testament, with open eyes, taking a step out of the box in which they've been taught this is who God is, this is how God acts. Right? If they just read the words themselves, even the translated words, the English words, it's very clear that this is not the God we've been taught to believe in, but that these are beings that are manipulating humanity for their own selfish purposes. And of course, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book, it is necessary to have the authoritative interpretation of the advocate so that we can see which parts are true and which parts are false, which parts are good, which parts are bad. Those terms good and bad are not often used in modern conversation, but they are real categories, right? There are things that are good and there are things that are bad. But that authoritative interpretation is necessary from the advocate as one goes passage by passage, just in order to know for certain what it is the Elohim are doing in a certain passage, what their intentions are, whether something has been theologized in a way that cloaks the truth. But the fundamental point of this lecture is the nature of the Elohim, their physical nature as extraterrestrial beings, their psychological and emotional nature as manipulative beings who have no compassion, no concern for humanity, but have created the human race in order to use the human race for their own selfish purposes. Right. In future lectures, we will address certain passages in depth from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we'll also address certain very important issues as it relates to the Elohist agenda on Earth and what humankind can do about it through our Arcturian guides and the path that they have set before us. May you be blessed. May the light of Jatasha shine in and through you. And until we quote unquote meet again, peace be with you.